Many of the things that we do in our lives, we do either because of work or because of our families. But what do we do when we have a free choice? A surprising number of us pursue the past. And it might be the past of our own place, or we may travel to another place and learn about its past. Our third speaker tonight is an expert in one of the more popular past locations, the Middle Ages. On the one hand, Dr. Aronstein is a hardcore expert. She went to Edinburgh and Stanford to learn the languages that are needed to work in this area, study the texts that were written. She spent years of her life deciphering what's possible to know about the people that created the text and the texts themselves. Her resume is full of articles in that field. On the other hand, Susan is interested in people like us. Why in the world do a bunch of us find an interest in the Middle Ages? And how do we express that? Dr. Aronstein has written extensively on Disney parks and storytelling, because much of what Disney does draws from the Middle Ages. Her first book, Hollywood Nights, a study of Arthurian narratives, focused on how 20th century film drew upon these stories and used them to support their own film ideas and imagery. Tonight, Dr. Aronstein will talk about another field that is drawn upon King Arthur, that of today's heritage tourism, and how that field shows what many of us want to do with our spare time. Dr. Aronstein.
Thank you. Sure, got this on. That sounds right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for staying. I know it's late now. Are you guys ready to do some time travel tourism? All right, let's do some time travel tourism. This is part of a larger project, and it was born about 15 years ago when about 7,000 people yearly go to their annual Kalamazoo pilgrimage, people who study the Middle Ages and descend upon a poor, innocent Michigan town. And 4 of us found ourselves in a conference, on a session, giving a paper on Monty Python and the Holy Grail, because hey, what do medievalists do, right? And so I met 3 other people, one from Boston, one from Ohio, and one from Michigan, and we started working together. So we've been doing collaborative work since then. And we do, as Paul pointed out, we both do, all of us do the kind of traditional Middle Ages, and we're also interested in the field called medievalism. And medievalism is pretty much anything that studies post-medieval interactions with the Middle Ages. So that could be anything from Tennyson's Idylls of the King, which I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight, to Monty Python and the Holy Grail, to a Disney movie, to Game of Thrones. And most of those things you'll notice are TV, television, narrative text. And at some point, we were at a conference, and we found ourselves at Tintagel in Cornwall, and we said, wouldn't it be fun if we wrote a book about the ways, and what we started to call medieval tourism, or the tourist Middle Ages, about the ways in which the medieval past is actually presented so that people can, quote unquote, experience. They can step back into it, they can see it, they can smell it, they can touch it. Wouldn't that be fun? So we all said, yeah, that would be a lot of fun. And so this is part of that project. We were working at various sites, and we started out with a series of questions for our sites. The first one was, what kind of Middle Ages do we have here anyway? What kind of vision of the Middle Ages are we being asked to look at as we walk through this castle, as we watch the knights joust? The second question we asked ourselves was, how are we allowed to experience it? Is it just we look at it, we read a lot of text about it like we're walking through a museum? Does it have those little pictures that look like they were made from a children's illustrated Bible, posted by stuff to tell us how they lived in the Middle Ages? Do they have historical reenactments? Do they encourage us to buy swords and crowns? Do they encourage us to wear gowns, take pictures? So how are we interacting with the sites? How are we embodied in the Middle Ages? So that was our second question. And then we decided to ask ourselves, how are they giving us this Middle Ages? What are the techniques? What past do they choose to tell, for instance? Because of course, anytime you go to an actual heritage site, say Bath in England, you're looking at a site that's been there for a very long time. So if you're going to make a tourist site out of it, what paths do you choose? And so for instance at Bath, you could choose all sorts. I mean, it's been around since Roman times, right? Well, when they redid Bath, they decided, well, we're going to have Roman baths. And so they have all these really kind of weird, cool holographs. But they don't do much with Jane Austen, or Regency, which is another huge time, a huge period in Bath. And finding the medieval Bath is almost impossible. We found it, there's one point where you walk through and it says, here's the King's Bath. And there, right there, you can see that line there, that's where the water was in the Middle Ages. That's all of medieval Bath left. Another example of what paths you choose or select is in Stonehenge. You guys have all seen pictures of Stonehenge, right? Oh, lovely stones, completely bare, plain, were one with nature and the mystery of time. To create that Stonehenge, they had to destroy a medieval village. It was in the way. So there's another thing you ask when you look at a heritage tourist site is, what was here that they took away because it wasn't authentic to the past that we've chosen to have? So that's another question we were looking at. And along that lines, we decided, how are they giving us authenticity? What is authentic about this? How do they claim it's authentic? How do they make us experience this authenticity? How do they give us something to look at? And so, for instance, you could have an actual site there, right? You could have the ruins of something. Is that what you want? Do you want just like, okay, in Glastonbury, one of the sites we're going to look at a little bit today. They have the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey. Once upon a time, this amazing abbey kind of fell afoul of Henry VIII and is no more. But the ruins are there. They're stunningly beautiful. Is that what you'd have? You have people go visit the ruins. Or do you say, no, people really want to go to the medieval past. Let's reproduce it. Let's build a new one. And then we can say this is an accurate castle, or accurate abbey, and you can go see it. So that's one way you can approach it, or two ways. You can leave the ruins there, which is this idea of the romantic gaze, and we can go look at the past that's no longer there and contemplate the ruins and the folly and transience of man in history. Or we can build one like it was and say this is authentic and you can experience it. Or we can do what Himmler did at Wewelsburg when he took the 16th century bishop's palace and wanted a more medieval looking place. And you can reconstruct it and add medieval features so this palace looks like what we think it should have looked like in the Middle Ages. So that's another option. Or one of our favorites is Jorvik. Jorvik, which is York, and it's on a Viking dig. And they got together, and this was in the early 80s, and it was flooded recently and redone. But they got together and decided, well, we'll have the authentic dig, so people can go look and they can see how we're doing the archaeology. But we'll also build ourselves a ride that takes us through a Viking village, complete with smellorama. I loved that part. And we'll let people experience what the Viking village that we are excavating would have been if only Disney had been there for us. So there's that sense. You can have an authentic site, and then you can build the theme apparatus around it. So those were all things that we were looking at and thinking about as we started working on this book. So what is authentic? What past do you bring back? Why would you bring that particular past back? I mean, there's often a question of what's politically or socially going on when you choose a particular version of a past at a site. Do you want to repress one past so that you can forget about it? Do you want to valorize a past? Wewelsburg is another great example of this because what do? You're in Germany, and Himmler kind of redid this kind of really interesting medieval castle as the ideological center for the SS. What do you do with it? So what they've chosen to do with that is they've separated the museum in two. And they've got all the SS artifacts in one museum that's entirely separate. And it's very heavily controlled in terms of text that you read and how they allow you to look at things and what you're allowed to take pictures of over there. And then they have the history of the Paderborn Castle, the Paderborn estate, and the bishops on the other side. And it totally skips over the Third Reich. It's like, okay, this is the real history of Germany over here, and here's this aberration over here. So that's one thing, another thing you can do with heritage. So we were looking at all of those things. And then we came across another really interesting question, and that's kind of what we're going to look at more specifically today, which is, when you think about medieval England, who do you think about? What's pretty much probably the first character that pops into your head when you say the Middle Ages in England? King Arthur, right? So you think about King Arthur. Pardon? Vortigern, yes, well, yes, but some people might think Vortigern. I think probably most people, I mean, if you've read lots of, yeah, you think about kings. But I think most, but pretty much, especially in America, probably the most, oddly enough, well-known medieval king is King Arthur. So a lot of, obviously, if you're in England and you want to make some money, you want to attract some tourists, what you want is you want King Arthur sites. What's the problem with that? We don't know if he existed. So here we're building heritage sites. Heritage sites are where we go. The truism, if you read a bunch of theory of heritage tourism, is heritage is the awarding of a past to space, or awards space a past. So we're awarding past to space by choosing which past we're going to look at. We're recreating it. We may messing with it some. But the theory is there's actually a past there that we're working with. King Arthur, real tourist draw, dubious, deeply dubious. Yeah, some guy who might have had the Arthurian legends based on him may once have existed, but even there are historical evidences centuries after it would have happened. So we have a king, great tourist draw. We're not going to miss that chance. We're going to have King Arthur sites. So what we're going to do tonight, and we may not get to both of them. I apologize. I think I may have overestimated how much I could do in 40 minutes. So, but we'll get to Tintagel at least. We might be able to grab a bit of Glastonbury on the way. But we have a heritage site, or a lot of heritage sites built out of a guy who is only found in fiction. Or what are we going to do about this? So one of the things we argue, or we've started to argue, is to think about the ways in which heritage tourism and media tourism converge at Arthurian sites. If heritage tourism awards space a past, what media tourism does is it allows fans and people like us to have an embodied experience of places we know from fiction. So we get, this is where it happened. I think one of the best examples of that these days is Platform 9.5 for Harry Potter fans. 3/4, I'm 3/4, sorry. Okay, wrong thing. I was going to say, Paul, it can't be 10 minutes already. So there, another good example of that is Game of Thrones tourism. I was recently with a bunch of medievalists who should know better in Iceland, and we went to Thingvalla, which is this famous kind of Viking site, and we're all like, oh, it's the wall! So that's media tourism. Media tourism is something that allows people a kind of geographic embodied experience of a place they've read or loved from fiction. I want to point out that Middle Ages, we have Arthurian tourism. If you think about Arthur being kind of embodied on the British landscape or placed in the British landscape, go back to 1136. You've got Geoffrey of Monmouth. He writes a book called The History of the Kings of Britain, which is a much longer work. Lear appears in it, for instance. But this is probably the first time we get the full story of, quote unquote, King Arthur in some version that we might recognize as moderns of the king of our fantasy. 1136, Geoffrey of Monmouth. I can get Monmouth, yeah. History of the Kings of Britain. So 1136, Geoffrey writes the History of Kings of Britain, and what he does is he identifies two spots. Well, he identifies a lot more, but the two spots I'm going to talk about today. One is Arthur's birthplace at Tintagel Castle in Cornwall, and the other is where Arthur either died or went to rest to come again, depending on what version of the story you're looking at, which is Glastonbury on the border of England and Wales, which Geoffrey has this nice long kind of etymology where it's going, well, in Welsh it's Innis Aval, which is the island of apples, which is Avalon, and so he gets the mythical there. So like I said, in 1136 we got Arthur in the English landscape. In 1191, in Glastonbury, like I said, identified by Geoffrey of Monmouth as Arthur's either death place or resting place, the monks of the Abbey of Glastonbury have just experienced a horrible fire. They need to rebuild. And while they're kind of figuring out how they're going to rebuild and how they're going to come up with the money to do it, they're kind of cleaning stuff up, and they make an amazing discovery. The amazing discovery they make is the grave of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. Wasn't that awesome? And they know it's the grave of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere because there's a cross in it that says, "Here lies Arthur, King of the Britons, and Guinevere, his second wife," in Latin inscription. They call in Henry II, who's totally delighted because Arthur coming back, maybe coming back to lead the Welsh, is a really bad thing if you're Henry. And if you can find his grave, you can say to all those nasty, rebellious Welsh people, look, he's dead, get over it. So it's good politically. It's even better for the monks of Glastonbury Abbey because now they have a major tourist attraction. And so and Glastonbury Abbey does become a major tourist attraction and a major tourist center. From the discovery of the grave on to the time they had their problems with Henry VIII and the monastery or the abbey is dissolved. That there is the grave marker, the sign, you can still see it where they excavated the grave of King Arthur in the ruins. So there's our first tourist site, Glastonbury Abbey. They have a grave. Heritage tourist site, immediate tourist site, 1191. Over here you have the ruins of Tintagel Castle. Lovely spot. I love Tintagel Castle and its ruins. It's built in the first half of the 13th century by Richard of Cornwall, who's the brother of Henry III. And what's interesting about Tintagel Castle is there's no bloody reason in the world why you would build a castle there. It's inaccessible. There's no economic reason to have it. There's certainly no military reason to have it. The only possible explanation for Richard building a castle there is to try to tap in for the Plantagenet line, which has its issues in terms of how legitimate it is, the imperial glory associated with Arthur. There's no other reason to build here. So Richard builds his castle in Tintagel. It's unclear quite what he ever did with it. It seems as though he may have used it kind of a summer home, but it was more of the fact that, hi, I'm Richard, and I have a castle where King Arthur was born, and where Geoffrey of Monmouth describes that moment in the story of King Arthur. So what happens is Tintagel Castle kind of fades into nothing. It falls into ruin very quickly by the early 16th century. Abbey similarly gets destroyed, right? 1539, I think, is the date on that, where the abbey gets destroyed. So you have now two sets of ruins. Until we have, in fact, then we're going to look at Tintagel, and I'll explain the quote later. Okay, so this is about 1840. The Reverend Warner goes on a trip of walking tour of Cornwall. The ruins of Tintagel Castle claim dominion over unqualified desolation, over one wide and wild scene of troubled ocean, barren country, and horrid rocks. To look at it was enough to give one the toothache. Tintagel is clearly not going to be a tourist spot at this point. Like I said, this is the first half of the 19th century. And then something happens that revives Arthurian tourism. And that is Alfred Tennyson publishes Idylls of the King starting, I believe it's 1859, I think. So he publishes Idylls of the King. And over a period of about 10 or 15 years. And suddenly, Arthurian tourism is all the rage. King Arthur is big again. Everybody wants to go to where Tennyson was inspired. Everybody wants to visit those sites. We have a problem, though, at Tintagel. And here's our problem here. This is from the English Illustrated magazine. A visit to Tintagel results in a certain amount of disillusion. It contains no relic, nothing that can verily be imagined a relic of the old, old times when the flower of chivalry ruled. As one walks down the solitary street and glances around to see that Tintagel, he sees that Tintagel's a cheerful, picturesque little place, but it is not Arthurian. Unless we go direct to those parts where nature is not and never has been molested. So this is the natural scenery. The great gorges and weird bays and caves, the rock-strewn valleys, the imposing waterfalls. From these may be constructed the scenery of the drama of the warlike king and his adventurous knights. We have any stuff. All we have is nature. Never ones to risk a good or to waste a good chance at making some money. Some of the captains of industry come into Tintagel, and suddenly Tintagel starts looking very different. The first thing they do is the village at that time is called Trevail, not Tintagel. We rename it. So we make an Arthurian site. This is about the process of building an Arthurian site. We name the village back to the right name. We start looking at all our natural landscape, and we start giving it Arthurian names. Arthur's bed, Arthur's footprint, Arthur's seat. Ooh, that's good. We start giving tours of Tintagel Castle, the ruins of Tintagel Castle. The Victorians come in and they do some nice rebuilding of stuff that's fallen down. So now, like some of the iconic stuff at Tintagel, especially the doorway that you often get a picture of, when you look at that, that's Victorian. That's not actually medieval at all. So we start building an Arthurian site. If you build it, they will come. We will make money. And one of the other things that's happened right now is the slate and the tin mining industries in Cornwall are kind of petering out. And so economically, there's a real kind of advantage to doing tourism. Cornwall as itself gets the brand name of King Arthur's land, which it kind of fought Wales for, but don't bother us. And what are you going to do with all them tourists? You're going to put them in a hotel. So you get, and you notice that's a Victorian, I don't know if it's an ideal of or a kind of very, it's very functional architecture that's been given just kind of hints of medieval. Richard Trevail built this hotel in 1899. It was called King Arthur's Castle Hotel. And it sits on the bluffs actually opposite of Tintagel Castle's ruins. So if you're driving in and you're looking for a castle, that's what you see. And it was advertised as being perched on the spot that inspired Tennyson to write the Idylls of the King, we're told. So you too can go here and be inspired by Arthurian landscapes. But of course, we have all the modern convenience, electric lights, as well as lifts for passengers. So it was this wonderful kind of combination of the two. So that's our first kind of building of King Arthur in Tintagel. And then after that, one of those tourists who comes in with the flood of tourism, kind of in the late 19th, early 20th century, is a guy who invented a custard powder and made a bloody fortune off of it. His name is Frederick Glasgow. He's a custard magnate. And he comes to Tintagel and says, this is where King Arthur is. This is where the spirit of English chivalry will be reborn. This is where I will settle and bring Arthur and his knights and chivalric behavior and chivalric ideals into the modern era. And I'm sorry, that I tried to make that picture slightly larger and it really pixelated. That very tiny picture there is one of the original gatherings of the Fellowship of the Round Table, founded in 1927 in Tintagel. There's a picture from the 1960s of the Fellowship still going in its robes. I met one of the seneschals of the Knight of the Order in Tintagel, who was lots of fun. I've been doing some research in the papers in the British Library. So he rebuilds, he founds this order. Right before World War II, it has about 250,000 members worldwide. And he decides, we need a castle, we need a hall, we need an initiation hall. So that there is King Arthur's Great Halls, which he built as a way of a gathering place, an initiation spot for his order. And that's some from the inside there. There's a granite, kind of a granite round table. There's a throne back there on a dais. There's a wooden round table. And you can see kind of that Sir Gareth there. It's got the Knights of the Round Table around it, and it's a gathering spot. It's almost like King Richard of Cornwall's castle. It's Tintagel, it's Arthur's birthplace. We've got to have a great hall. So he built this in the 1930s, and you can still visit this hall today. Obviously, that's how I got the pictures. But what's really interesting to me, the most interesting thing to me about this hall was, you go in and you think, oh, this is going to be cheesy. They've got some really bad kind of Victorian, late Victorian, early 20th century paintings of King Arthur's story. And then they take you into this hall that has like a laser show with the voice of Merlin telling you the story of King Arthur. And it's like, oh, please help me. And then you walk into this hall, and this stuff is fun. This is cool here. But what this King Arthur's Hall has is what I would call a real Arthurian relic, even though it's not Arthurian at all, as in it's not medieval and it's not King Arthur. Let's see if I can get these up. These aren't coming out nearly as well as I would like them, too big. These windows, there are 93 of them. They were commissioned by Glasscock to tell the story of King Arthur as his order had rewritten it. And they were done by a woman named Veronica Wall, who was a student of Louis Comfort Timpany's. And these are some of the most beautiful windows you will ever see. They're playing of the light, and they're here. And so again, Arthurian story, Arthurian tourist type in Tintagel. Is it Arthurian? No. I mean, or is it medieval Arthurian? Is it heritage? No. But is it a space where you can experience kind of the remnants or relics of a narrative and media tourism here? Okay, but time passes on, and in 1999, King Arthur's Hotel is rebought. It's bought by a guy named John Mappin. And you will see John Mappin there in medieval drag, pulling a sword from a stone, kind of sort of stone. He buys the hotel, he remodels it, he fills it with replicas. So he's got a couple replicas of the Winchester Round Table. He's got all sorts of kind of pseudo-medieval stuff in there. He's there, he's pulling out the sword that he's holding so happily is a replica of John Borman's replica of Excalibur from the movie Excalibur. So you can see you have fakes upon fakes upon fakes upon fakes here. But what's interesting about Mappin, which gives us a kind of interesting segue to talk about Glastonbury in a bit, is he argues the hotel doesn't matter, all the replicas don't matter. What is Arthurian here is the energies, the door to the universe, the essential energies, the ley lines. And so he says, Camelot will awaken here. So this is where we're going to find Camelot, not because of anything we built on it. So that the fact that there was no King Arthur and we have no Arthurian relic doesn't matter, because the real authentic stuff is just here. It's in the land, it's in the landscape, it's in the powers that are waiting to get out. It's in my magic light box. And so he claims that in the depths of Camelot Hotel, there's a light box which will give us the mysteries of the universe. So yeah, reading the tourist reviews on this is hysterical, because it also turns out, and there's not enough time to explore this tonight, but it also turns out that he's built this as a center of Scientology. There's some really interesting stuff with Mappin going on. But there again, it's an Arthurian heritage media tourist site that now becomes kind of inflected, not through New Age mysticism, which is what it looks like it's going to be, but it becomes more and more definitely Scientology. as you look further into Mappin's hotel. It's a really bizarre place. We did not stay there. It actually kind of gave me the creeps, but it was really interesting. Okay, so what have you got now in Tintagel? You have a spot where King Arthur is everywhere but nowhere. So you can see we have King Arthur's arms, we have King Arthur's car park. This is just a few things, King Arthur's cafe. You've got, so everything's named after King Arthur. You have, I love this place. This is the fantasy photo place, and you notice you can take your picture as a witch, or as a knight, or as a fairy. And so what you have in Tintagel now is a bunch of Arthurian names, a 13th century, early 13th century, ruins of an early 13th century castle that was reconstructed in the medieval period, a medieval 19th century hotel that's been transformed into a center for Scientology. You have a bunch of kitsch shops and fairies and elves and crystal stones you can buy, a bunch of stuff named after King Arthur, and one set of astounding windows. And yet, people come flocking to Tintagel to experience King Arthur. Although, like I said, it's everywhere and nowhere. So let's move to another site. Okay, so this is the birthplace. I love that was something I found on the internet where someone had put the bouncy castle up there, and it just cracked me up because in some ways it kind of said it all. You might go back to the English Illustrated magazine actually for Tintagel, and I think what they do still have is this sense of amazing scenery. All right, so we're going to quickly move to Glastonbury. We're not going to get all of Glastonbury in, clearly. But Glastonbury is another case where Arthur gets kind of invented and reinvented and built on the landscape in the 19th century post-Tennyson. But this one to me is even more interesting because of the ways in which it's not as, what's the word I want, not as cynically may not be the right word, but not as obviously touristy. It's not as much like let's bring the tourist in and build stuff for them to see, or let's bring our order in. It's not this kind of human gathering, but rather a mystical gathering. Dion Fortune writes a book in the early 20th century. She was a theosophist. She writes a book called Avalon of the Heart. And she says 3 roads lead to our English Jerusalem, the holiest earth in England, the high road of history, which tells the spiritual story of our race, the upland path of legend traveled by both saints and Arthur and his knights, and the mystic way leading through the hidden door to Avalon of the Heart. So for Fortune and others who come to Glastonbury in the late 20th, or the late 19th, early 20th century, Glastonbury is associated with Arthur as only one piece of evidence of this kind of spiritual center, this mystic way. Glastonbury is a place where these 3 roads meet, where time and space there's almost like a gap in the time-space continuum, where all of history and the past and the present can coexist side by side. Or then you've got Jeffrey Ash, who says most people who get close to Glastonbury seem to go mad. When these people called themselves the Avalonians, when they arrived in Glastonbury, it was a kind of sleepy market town. And you can see some pictures of Glastonbury from kind of the early 19th century, including that's a picture of the ruins. The ruins were lovely and romantic, and you did lovely paintings of them. But there wasn't much going on. And I think this is the only bit I'm going to have a chance to look at here. But I'll tell you the story of the first moment where we get the Arthurian inscribed into Glastonbury landscape. There was a guy named Reverend Dr. John Goodchild. And Dr. John Goodchild had been wintering in Italy and taking care of the English expatriates who also wintered there. And about 18 years before this happened, in 1899, he had bought a bowl in Italy. There's that bowl there. And 18 years later, he has a vision. And this voice in the vision says, "This is the cup of Jesus carried at the Last Supper. You must take it to Glastonbury, where it will be found, and usher in a new age of chivalry. So Dr. Goodchild says, take it to Glastonbury. Okay, I'll do that. He takes it to Glastonbury. He buries it in St. Bride's Well and waits for somebody to find it. People didn't find it fast enough for him. In 1902, that's Wesley Tudor Pole. Wesley has a vision, a dream where he's convinced he was a monk in a previous life, and he had lived in Glastonbury. And he continues to have visions about Glastonbury, and he starts going to Glastonbury and staying there and kind of walking the hills. And one day he's sitting in his office doing his accounts, and on his wall in 1902, he sees a vision of the Holy Grail. And he's told, you and 3 maidens will find a grail and bring in the next stage of chivalry and the new order of spirituality. So Wesley needs himself some maidens. There are his maidens, they're his sister Kitty, and 2 sisters, Christine and Jane Allen. Christine also has a couple of visions that she's going to find herself a grail. And sure enough, in 1906, aided a little bit by Goodchild, who sends a picture of another vision he had about finding his grail, just in St. Bride's Well, to Wesley Tudor Pole, Christine finds herself a grail. So Christine finds the Glastonbury Grail. She picks it up. It's all over the newspapers. Glastonbury is at that moment becomes again a medieval tourist site. We found ourselves a grail. Do I have time for one more, Paul, or should I stop? Keep going. Okay. Okay, there's that person. Over here, in 1906, the ruins of the Abbey go up for auction. An American really, really, really wants them, but doesn't get them. Somebody buys them and gives them to the Church of England. So the Church of England says, yes, Glastonbury Abbey, we need an archaeologist, we need an archaeological dig, let's go for it. They hire this guy here. His name is Frederick Bligh Bond. And in and that Bligh, by the way, it is mutiny about the Bounty Bligh. And in 1908, he starts excavating. He has quite a bit of success, actually, and a lot of the knowledge we have about Glastonbury and its architecture is from Frederick Bligh Bond's excavations. Unfortunately, or fortunately, in 1918, Bond publishes a book called The Gates of Remembrance, in which he claims that he knew where to excavate because Brother Johannes, who was a 12th century monk, has been telling him where things are and has delivered these prophecies through automatic writing. So The Gates of Remembrance is published in 1918. It's supposedly delivered totally through automatic writing from Brother Johannes. And in it, Johannes claims to be one of the Company of Avalon, which is this spiritual connected company that protects England from invaders. And that Glastonbury is the space where they meet and bring together and watch over England, and Bligh Bond is kind of their successor. The church is not surprisingly not entirely happy about this. Bond gets fired and is exiled to America and isn't allowed actually to come back to the Abbey. He gets kicked out a couple of times. But he wants to come excavate because he said, no, the grail they found isn't the right grail. The real grail's in the Abbey, and I have to go get it. So that's Bond. And I'm going to skip through the 60s and 70s because we don't have time for them. But those are things from a magazine called Candolph's Garden, which also identifies Glastonbury as the space of New Age return. That is King Arthur Uther Pendragon. He believes that he is the reincarnation of King Arthur. He actually carries a ceremonial sword and has the right to do so. He went to court for that right. And he's really involved in kind of the Echo Warrior movement in Britain now, and one of his homes is Glastonbury. I think I'll end here. This is Glastonbury today. Glastonbury is a most particular place. This is King Arthur Uther's biographer. If he was King Arthur, there was almost certainly half a dozen Arthurs at the same time. If he was waiting for his Merlin, there was probably a few of those as well. A multitude of reincarnated witches, warlocks and wizards, and fakers and fabulous dreamers and harmless lunatics and people who wanted to tend their gardens but had an obsession with a certain kind of illegal plant. So what you have at Glastonbury today is a competition between what's called, the unofficial heritage complex. So these are the mystics and the goddesses and the dowsers, and the Abbey, which is desperately trying to have an official history, official heritage site. And as you can see, they're all dressed as kind of people that, as they would have been at the moment of the Abbey's dissolution. So that's the past they choose to tell. But even they can't do it all. That sign's about dowsing in the Abbey. So you can douse still as long as you leave the Lady Chapel alone. All right. Sorry, the end of that was very, very fast. I bit off more than I could chew.
Well, thank you very much.
Just,
We have time for a few questions. You direct them to...
yes.
If you were to run a poll today in England or maybe another poll in the United States, what percentage of people in that poll would believe that King Arthur was real in those polls?
Depends on probably your audience. I would say if were I to ask my students, was King Arthur real? Probably about 90%. But, you know, kind of a funny anecdote along that line. I belong to an academic society called the International Arthurian Society, and we have biannual conferences, international conferences. And one year, a bunch of us were lobbying to go to Australia because the poor Australians always have to travel. And we thought it would be nice of us if we went there, and besides, we hadn't been to Australia. And the people from the French contingent said, we can't go to Australia because there are no Arthurian sites in Australia. King Arthur was never there. And we're all going, you know, guys, fictional character, never anywhere. But of course, their idea is like it's rooted in the literature. So, but I do think that probably, depending, but I would say certainly among young kids, about 90%. You wonder. Okay, Winston Churchill once said, all of it, and more if King Arthur, well, I'm going to mingle the quote, but if King Arthur wasn't true, he should have been all of it and more beside. So it should have been. He should have been true, even if he's not. And I think Churchill goes on to say he's the spirit of England, and we're all King Arthur kind of stuff. Questions?
How important is it, I think you're doing, that King Arthur sort of persists and sort of haunts children's fiction? I'm thinking about things like Susan Cooper, you know, Arthur's never there, the knights are sort of there.
Yeah.
Or, you know, there's a Rudyard Kipling, there's, you know, there's on and on and on, it just keeps popping up.
And I think that's it. I mean, to go back to the question that was asked in the second talk, you know, what is the cultural sustainability of Arthur? And I think a lot of it is that ability to haunt the children's fiction and to be, I mean, just think of, I mean, we just had a new King Arthur movie, what, 2 years ago? The Guy Ritchie one? So just think of the ways in which it continues to pop up. The Merlin series that was on TV not too far ago, the Camelot series. So I do think that kind of perpetual, and that's what keeps the media tourism going. I mean, if no one knew who Arthur was, you know, we might just say, hey, here's a cool 13th century castle, come see. I mean, the best thing about the 13th century castle at Tintagel, their proudest thing, if you're looking at the kind of official history tours, they have a medieval toilet. And they like to show us where that medieval toilet is. But most people are really just looking for King Arthur.